The heels came first, a precise, arrogant staccato on my kitchen tiles, and then Tiffany's voice, bright and rehearsed, as if she were reading the menu of a restaurant she owned, not stepping into my house. "Margaret, we're coming for dinner. We're bringing Alejandro and Valeria. It will be lovely. I thought you might make your stew." She smiled as she said it, the kind of smile that rearranged the room around her confidence. I set the saucer down without looking. The ceramic made a soft, familiar clack. My hands were steady. For 36 years I had stood at this counter, stirring, peeling, cutting, returning the ladle when everyone else had finished. I had been the pivot of this small family, the one they expected to rotate around. And then, after the divorce, I had watched the pivot break and scatter in a dozen directions. He had left me with memories and a mortgage and a bank account that felt like a whisper. That was the quiet part. The rest of it had been louder. The assumptions, the errands, the small requests that were never returned. "No," I said, and the single word landed between us like a dish on the table. It surprised Tiffany just for a sliver of a second. Her smile didn't drop. It wavered, recalibrated. "I'm not cooking tonight. If you want to read the whole story, stay with me to the end. If this matters to you, subscribe and like. There's more here than a single night in the kitchen." She blinked as if I had misunderstood. Kevin hovered behind her, hands in his pockets, the way a man does when he's not sure whether to take a side. "Mom," he started, the familiar opening I had heard for decades, always the prelude to someone else finishing the sentence I had written in invisible ink. "I'm not your mother on demand," I said. "I'm Margaret. I have plans." The word plans tasted iron on my tongue, small but deliberate. It was true. Plans, and a patience sharpened into purpose. They left laughing, too early, as if I had told a joke. I closed the kitchen door and stood with my back against it. The pantry hummed with the stale, warm smell of flour and canned tomatoes. The clock ticked in the hallway like an impartial witness. The sound of my own breathing was a small legal thing, proof that I existed beyond the obligations others assigned me. The years before the divorce ran like a film strip across my mind, not continuous, but frames. Mornings of ironing shirts that never left the hamper smelling of cedar. Afternoons of negotiating dinner plans with a man who had become a blur of newspapers and stern nods. Evenings where I asked for small courtesies and received tut-tuts. When he left, he took the small things first. The linen with his initials, the car that always smelled faintly of his cologne, the part of his name that had been carved into how we paid bills. He did not take the house. That would have been mercifully final. Instead, he left a complicated mess of bills and signatures and a belief that given enough time, people would remember who had kept them fed and comfortable. Tiffany's arrival had been gradual. When Kevin moved home after the accident that wasn't an accident but a convenience, she came with him. She had charm and a way of arriving as if the world owed her space. At first, I welcomed her. I had raised a son, and I knew the relief a young presence could bring. Then tasks multiplied. Could you pick up this? The soft escalations that weigh like paper until they become bricks. Sheets changed without thanks, meals cleared without notice, recipes appropriated and renamed in her voice. Compliments were currency, spent at will, then withheld. I found the folder by accident. It was not dramatic, a slip of cream paper caught under a cereal box when I reached for the oats. The box toppled, the folder slid into view like a clandestine revelation. My fingers closed around its edge. Inside were envelopes, copies, receipts with my handwriting on them, and signatures that were not mine, bank forms with dates that made my stomach drop. There were also photographs, one of my father, younger than I remembered, holding a card at an office desk. The card was yellowed, his smile was stubborn. On the back, someone had written a name, a note. It was an old bank card for an account he'd opened in another time. He had kept it the way some people keep maps to places they never go back to. I did not show it to Kevin. I did not show it to Tiffany. I slept on the couch for 3 nights, the seasons of the ceiling fan moving my thoughts in circles. On the 4th morning, I called a private detective. His name was Parker, and he smelled faintly of coffee and efficiency. He arrived with a laptop and a skepticism practiced like a trade. He had a soft way of letting things out of people, small, precise questions that rearranged truths into readable evidence. We met in the diner by the post office. He slid a manila envelope across the vinyl, and when I opened it, he would not look at my face. He said, "No glitter, no drama. You want proof? We get it quiet." We compiled a list, unauthorized charges, an unusual mortgage reapplication, a chain of emails that suggested a shift in decision-making about the house. Who could sign, who could access, who had authority. The paperwork had been arranged with a kind of naivety that was clever. Signatures slightly off, dates transposed, a notarization that read true unless you actually compared the ink. Someone had been rewriting small ledgers of my life. Robert, the lawyer, was a different sort of calm. He used words like remedy and quiet title and explained them without condescension, like a man describing the weather. "We'll nail these down," he said, and his hands folded in a patient steeple. He did not promise immediate miracles. He spoke in terms of steps. Steps were what I had been denied for decades. Small, visible progress. We met in his office, where the light pooled on the conference table. He asked me what I wanted, and I said I wanted the house to bear my name without question. I wanted any attempt to take advantage of my diminished circumstances to be recorded and reversed, and I wanted a clear line drawn between being helpful and being expected. In the meantime, we needed the bank. I walked into the branch on a day that held the salt air promise of rain. The banker on duty, a young woman whose hair was a careful, professional helmet, greeted me with a smile that almost matched Tiffany's. I had a small, folded card in my hand, my father's card. It was not a directive, it was history. I had brought it because Parker had suggested it might surface something. Maybe it would show a link, maybe it would show nothing at all. I had the habit of gathering fragments and seeing if they fit into a larger picture. The woman behind the desk took the card and turned it as if it were a coin. Her brows drew together. She asked for identification, which I handed over. Her fingers moved, deliberate. She returned the card to the center of the desk and, without any grand announcement, leaned forward and said, "Miss Hargrove, do you know who signed these recent loan modifications?" The name on the recent documents was familiar in an odd way. A practiced, confident looping that I had seen when someone signed checks for months. I told her I did not. She slid a sheet across, a blotched photocopy, and pointed to a signature that mimicked my father's, only smoother, as if an echo had been ironed out. My mouth folded around the memory of his handwriting. He had an uneven hand, a tremor like an old river. This signature had none of that. It was wrong the way a copied voice is wrong. She tapped the card again. "This card is in your father's name," she said. "It matches the account that was accessed to secure these recent loans. We have a fraud alert system. When certain triggers line up, like a family card being used as confirmation against other documents that don't match, we put a temporary freeze and open a review. It may be nothing, it may be something, but I need to call security." Her voice did not dramatize it. It simply became busier, like a kettle starting to boil. Around us, the fluorescent lights hummed. The bank's interior smelled faintly of paper and lemon cleaner. I felt something like a small beginning relief, the first key in the lock. "Will that stop them?" I asked. I asked it like a woman asking if rain would stop dust from settling. "It will stop money leaving," she said. "It will stop accounts from being moved. It will give time to verify signatures and trace transfers. If there is fraud, we can trace where the funds went. She pushed a form toward me. You'll need to make a statement. I nodded. It felt legal in a way that was almost ceremonial. After the divorce, he had left me broke in the practical sense. Empty bank balances, a frayed credit history, the small indignities of being told how to spend what little I had. He had assumed that without him, my life would be unmoored and I would be grateful for the crumbs. But gratitude is a peculiar currency. It does not pay mortgages. When I came home, the house felt the way a body feels when someone discovers a bruise and presses a finger to test it. Tiffany had rearranged the cushions, left a lipstick mark on a coffee cup, as if to claim the room by scent. I set the folder on the counter where she could see it. I did not announce anything. I turned the radio on at a low volume and sliced an apple. The kitchen smelled like cinnamon. The counter was cool under my knuckles. That night, I booked a hotel room with an ocean view. It was the sort of selfish thing I had rarely allowed myself in the years since the divorce, a room with a bed where no one would need anything of me. I packed lightly, a cardigan, a book, a small box of photographs that included my father's card. I left a note on the kitchen table that read, "I'm out, dinner is in the oven, please help yourselves." It was not passive-aggressive. It was an experiment. When I arrived at the hotel, the room was all salt scent and glass. I opened the balcony and let the wind undo me. The ocean made a distant drum. I drank tea in the silence and planned like a person who had been small and learning to be large. Names to call, people to talk to, phrases to say. Robert had prepared documents he wanted me to sign. Parker had a timeline. I made a list and crossed items off as if I were checking the runs of a loom. That night, Tiffany called. She asked where I was. Kevin asked too, but his voice had a different undercurrent now. Not anger, but a kind of alarm. I said simply, "I'm out, don't make dinner." She laughed, a brittle sound, and said, "Fine, we'll eat out, no big deal." But there was an edge to it, the faint sound of someone measuring out panic. The next morning, I read the email from the bank. "We have placed a hold pending verification," it said. It was a bureaucratic sentence with the heft of a gavel. The freeze meant the lender could not proceed with any new encumbrance on the house. The thief with the practiced signature had hit a speed bump. I watched the sunlight tilt across the sand and felt something settle in my chest that wasn't exactly relief, but it bore a relation to it. Then the calls began. Alejandro, whom I had always suspected kept his loyalty measured and practical, called with a voice that was finally on my side. Valeria's message was full of questions, as sisters' voices often are. Why did you leave? How long had you known? Marco texted a single line, "Come home, we'll talk." Kevin called and apologized and then clumsily offered to help. Tiffany's messages veered between incredulous and pleading. "We didn't mean to," she wrote, and then, "Mom, this is serious." I did not respond to the pleading. I let the bank's freeze do its work while we set other things in motion. Robert prepared a packet of legal notices to be served if necessary. Parker continued his quietly devastating work, tracking small transfers, showing me where money had been rerouted to accounts in unfamiliar names, how purchases had been made in my name and charged to lines I did not know existed. It was not dramatic in the way movies make theft. It was small, almost respectful in its pettiness, as if someone had been careful to take what they thought I would not notice. When I finally returned, it was with a calm I had not felt in a long time. My hair had a wind-blown edge from the hotel, my cardigan smelt faintly of the sea. The house looked the same, and yet I saw it differently. The pantry as a ledger, the china cupboard as evidence of habit. I placed the banker's email and the photocopies on the kitchen table in a neat stack. I told Kevin and Tiffany to sit down. They did not sit together. Tiffany perched on the edge of control, her heels tucked beneath her like a weapon. Kevin sat as if he had been tasked with holding space between his mother and his wife. "What is this?" Tiffany asked, light and clinical. I did not speak at first. I listened to the clock. The heels had their own history in this house. Now they felt like loud punctuation. I picked up a photograph of my father holding his card and set it in the middle of the table. The paper was thin, the edges worn. "Do you know this card?" I asked. My voice was neutral, the way a judge's is neutral, an instrument of decision. Tiffany's eyes flicked to the photo and then to Kevin. For a brief second, she was not a practiced person of charm. She was a woman noticing that the scaffolding she'd built might creak. "It's an old family thing," she said. "Why are you—" "That card led to a freeze at the bank," I said. "Someone used my father's account as a paper trail to move money and sign documents. The bank halted it. They contacted me. We are investigating." Tiffany's mouth tightened. "There must be some mistake. I would never." She did not finish. Kevin's jaw worked. He had the look of someone watching a slow avalanche and realizing he had placed the shovel. It was in that pause, in the small hollow they left where excuses might have been, that I realized the nature of the victory I wanted. I did not want spectacle. I did not want humiliation rendered into gossip. I wanted truth. I wanted documents that matched facts, signatures that meant what they claimed, boundaries that would not be crossed again. Robert arrived as if he'd been waiting for a signal. He set folders on the table like a surgeon laying out tools. "We are prepared to file a declaratory action," he said simply. He explained what we would ask the court to declare, that the house's title was unambiguous, that any attempted transfer without my informed consent was void, and that the bank's freeze permitted a window to correct the record. He used legal phrases the way a gardener uses seeds, precise with a purpose. He did not promise revenge. He promised remedy. The family reacted in a variety of ways. Alejandro, practical and cool, said he would support whatever was necessary to correct the records. Valeria cried quietly in the kitchen and told me things siblings tell each other when the shell has been cracked open. Old debts, slights, a history of assumptions. Marco was blunt. "We should have seen it sooner," he said. Kevin's face was a map of guilt and recognition. He clasped his hands and said, "I'm sorry, Mom. I should have listened." The apology was raw in a way I had not expected. Tiffany, at last, went pale. There, in the kitchen where she'd once directed my movements like a stage director, she sat and felt small. The confrontation Robert arranged was not a spectacle. It was surgical. He asked them to come to the living room. He asked the bank to send a representative. He prepared copies of the evidence and asked that they be given time to respond. The lawyer's presence turned private accusation into public record. When the bank's representative arrived, a woman with a calm demeanor and a badge, she confirmed what the freeze had done: blocked transfers, suspended loan modifications, alerted fraud investigators. She spoke plainly, and in doing so, she gave the situation gravity. I watched Tiffany when the bank representative mentioned the card. For a moment, I thought she might break down. Instead, she grew thin with strategy, as if she were rearranging the furniture of her own thoughts. "There must be a mix-up," she said, voice leveled. She offered proofs she did not have. Her hands searched for purchase and came up empty. It was then that I felt the moral shape of what I had to do. This was not about winning a fight. It was about drawing lines that would keep me free. I had spent decades being available in ways that had asked nothing of the world and received less than fairness. Now I wanted to be available on my own terms. After the meeting, when everyone had left in various stages of confusion and contrition, I walked through the house. The kitchen smelled faintly of the stew that had cooled in the oven, a domestic sacrament untouched. I opened a cupboard and ran my fingers along the ridges of the plates. The house had been a sanctuary. For a while, it had felt like a stage upon which others acted out their lives. I set my palm on the worn banister and felt the grooves my hand had worn over years of holding it steady. There was vindication in what we'd accomplished so far. Not retribution, but correction. The bank's freeze had bought us time. Parker's reports had given us clarity. Robert's filings had created teeth for the law to bite. The hardest thing, I think, was watching Kevin move through the phases of denial, hurt, and finally admission. He came to me one evening with a look of a young man learning the gravity of grown-up mistakes. "I let her," he said. "I thought it would all work out. I'm sorry I didn't see you." I did not lecture him. I told him what I needed: transparency, respect for agreement, and an end to the small, corrosive requests that had worn me down. He promised, clumsily but sincerely. Promises are fragile. They must be tended like seedlings. I believed him enough to let him begin to water them. Tiffany did not stay. She packed a few things and left with the briskness of someone leaving a set after a scene doesn't go as planned. I do not think she saw the moral wrong in the way I had, but I also think she saw the practical consequences. When banks freeze and lawyers file, there is little room for charm to curl words into deeds. There was a small, quiet victory some weeks later. The bank concluded its review and sent a letter confirming that the suspicious transactions would be reversed pending formal action and that the freeze had prevented further encumbrance. The lender adjusted its filings. Robert filed the necessary declarations to assert my title with clarity. Parker delivered a final report that felt both clinical and compassionate. He had done his job without spectacle and given me a record that could not be shrugged away. In the end, the thing I most wanted, beyond legal remedy, was dignity. I wanted my neighbors to stop smiling as if I were a character in a story about generosity, and instead see me as a person with boundaries. I wanted the house to be a home that belonged to me, not only on paper, but in practice. I wanted the pantry to be mine, not an inventory of others' needs. The last scene, the one people always want to hear, was not a shout or a dramatic eviction. It was quiet. I stood in the kitchen one Sunday morning, feet bare on the cool tiles, sun slanting through the blinds. I made coffee before anyone asked. I did not hurry. When Kevin sat down, he poured his own. We ate toast. The house hummed with ordinary life. It was, I thought, a good thing to be ordinary on one's own terms. Someone asked me later whether I felt vindictive. I did not. I felt firm, like the oak that has weathered multiple seasons and finally stands without leaning on anyone. Justice had been done insofar as institutions could do it. Relationships were being renegotiated in the small, ongoing ways that matter. I had drawn the line, and people now understood where it was. When the banker first looked at my father's card and made the call, it was a small, almost bureaucratic gesture, but it was a hinge. It bought me time, and time is what strategy is made of. I had spent years giving myself away in ways that felt noble until they did not, and then learning how to take myself back without turning my life into theater. There were consequences and apologies and quiet repairs. There were phone calls I returned and some I did not. The house remained mine. The pantry held jars I had labeled and recipes I had written on quarters of paper. The notes were mine alone. On an afternoon months after the freeze, I met Parker for coffee at the little diner where we'd first met. He looked as if he needed fewer details explained now. He tapped the table and said, "You did it without theatrics. That's rare." "No theatrics," I agreed. "Just papers and patience." I smiled at him and finished my tea. The heels returned to the memory as an echo, not a summons. The clicking was now a rhythm I could place in the past. There were small rewards, almost mundane. I found a shoebox of my father's letters in the attic and read them in the afternoon light. Felt a softness in remembering him. I replaced a leaky faucet with my own hand and did not feel belittled for the task. I learned to say no without staining my voice with apology. The last thing I did, the one that felt like sealing the change, was to set out a pizza on paper towels for a simple, indifferent dinner, and eat it with Kevin on the couch, feet on the coffee table, a television humming in the background. The pizza was ordinary, and ordinary was a reclamation. I laughed when Kevin made a joke that landed badly. He looked at me as if he were testing me. I laughed again, and his smile was a small human thing. People ask what they would do in my place, and I do not like the question because it suggests a hypothetical courage that often feels dearer in the telling than in the living. I tell them instead what I did. I noticed the pattern, I gathered evidence, I waited until I had a legal lever, and then I used it. I refused to be the domestic engine that everyone took for granted. I set boundaries and let the world adjust. There were no fireworks. There was instead the banker's quiet call, the lawyer's measured steps, Parker's dry reports, and the slow, stubborn realignment of family expectations. When my son hugged me that night on the couch, he did not ask me to make his tea. He poured it himself. The house remains my name on the title, my mother's teapot on the shelf, my father's card tucked into a box. Sometimes I take it out and look at it, and marvel that a small rectangle of plastic could have been a lever for such mischief. The banker had frozen accounts because a card and a signature didn't add up. That sliver of scrutiny saved me months, maybe years, of more subtle erasure. People like tidy endings. I offer a tidy one only insofar as it is honest. The legal matters were contained, the bank reversed certain transfers, Tiffany left under the weight of practical consequence. Kevin began to learn to shoulder his own life. I did not gain a fortune. I gained something quieter. The knowledge that my life would not be rearranged because I had been taught to accommodate others' conveniences. I learned the sound of my own feet crossing the kitchen in the morning and the delight of making a single cup of coffee just for myself. There is a line in one of my father's letters about small kinds of courage. Not the blazing ones, but the ones that keep a door shut when the world thinks it should be opened. I keep thinking of that as I water my plants, label jars, and answer mail. The banker saw a card and froze. The freeze gave me a doorway to set things right. It was not dramatic. It was the sort of correction that matters. On the porch one evening, with a cup of tea cooling between my hands, I told Kevin, nothing about this was because I wanted to be difficult. It was because I wanted to be honest. He nodded. You were always honest, he said. We just didn't always listen. We both laughed softly at that, the kind of laugh that has some relief baked into it. The house was quiet. The pantry held, among other things, the stew recipe I had refused to make the night they first came with their guests. I had refused then so I could reclaim now. It felt, in a small and necessary way, like justice. Outside, the evening gathered itself. Inside, the radio played a song that sounded like an old friend. I sat back and let the sound fill the room. In the drawer where I kept the legal papers, there was a final note from Robert. Case closed, pending any appeal. I smiled at the cautious language. It was almost modest. The house stayed mine. I kept the card in the shoebox, a relic and a reminder. Life returned to its quiet rhythms, but I moved through them with a different stance. Not passive, not defensive, simply upright. There are still mornings when I wake and the old habit of readiness reaches for me, the reflex to get up early to make breakfast for others. Now I make it for myself sometimes and for no one else at all. The freedom tastes like cinnamon and black coffee, and it is enough. Some mornings the house seemed to contrive silence around me, as if the walls were practicing a new language of respect. I moved through that hush with the small deliberations of someone who had learned how to inhabit a life without apologizing for its edges. I brewed coffee in the old pot, wiped the rim of the mug with the back of my hand, set a saucer for Kevin, though I did not expect him to be pleased into ceremony. He appeared in the doorway with his hair still mussed, carrying a bowl he had made for himself that morning. A scrambled egg softened with milk and the faint, proud scatter of a chopped herb. "You're doing that now?" I said. He shrugged, half-smile, and handed me the teapot as if it were an offering. "Figured I'd try. You seem to like the idea of not being obliged." I let my smile be a quiet thing. It was not the triumph of someone who had won a war. It was the small recognition of mutual learning. He had always been good at small gestures that came unprepared. Now they came without the shadow of calculation. He asked about the mail, an ordinary question, and when I told him there was nothing important, he made a face that meant relief rather than disappointment. Relief, I thought, was a newer currency between us. The boy, my son, had slipped into competence with an economy that made my heart unclench. He no longer asked permission for every small thing. He boiled eggs for himself on Saturdays and left the pan to soak rather than invoke me as a midwife to domestic labor. Once, while I sliced a lemon for tea, he appeared at the counter and said, "Do you want some company?" And I realized it was the first time he had offered rather than solicited. It was the sort of progress that did not announce itself with fanfare. It simply made the home quieter in a different, healthier way. I volunteered, sporadically at first, at a small community office that helped people navigate bureaucratic knots, benefits, banking errors, the kind of paperwork that could fillet a week into despair. I had expected my participation to be procedural, sit at a desk, file forms, pass on empathy in measured doses. Instead, it felt like turning a key. There was a woman there whose hands trembled when she held a bank letter. The bank had frozen her account after a string of curious transfers. She sounded like someone I had once been, apologetic, certain she had caused the trouble by mistake, self-blaming before anyone else had. When she told me her story, something in me tightened and then settled. I found the cadence of the interrogating questions, the ones Parker had asked me in his dry, efficient way, running along my tongue. "Did you authorize this transfer?" I asked, and the woman blinked as if I had given her permission to be honest. She had not. Her card had been used at a cafe she had never visited. A signature did not match hers. I sat with her on the edge of the plastic chair and wrote down dates. I called the bank with the official form and a softer voice. The clerk on the line asked for names. I supplied them. When I hung up, the woman looked at me with gratitude that had been spared him 100 earlier slights. Helping her did not make my own scars vanish, but it gave them a purpose. If my caution had once been a source of shame, now it served as a tool someone else could borrow. Parker turned up at the community office on a Tuesday because he liked the coffee there and because dry reports did not absolve him of curiosity. He saw me working with a tangle of papers and slid into the chair opposite, the way someone who had been trained to observe people also learned how to hold them at a measured distance. "You look good," he said, oddly private for a man who had once been only professional. Less on edge. "I owe you a thank you," I said, because the debt felt like a kind of truth. He shrugged. "We did what was necessary. It wasn't me. It was diligence, which is less noble but more useful." We spoke then about small, practical things, about how to help the woman with the frozen account, about forms that insisted on proving identity twice over. Parker talked about books he had read, awkwardly, about the absurdity of how records that were meant to protect could also be instruments of erasure. He admitted that he had children he saw on weekends, and that sometimes he felt as if he were learning to be a father in rehearsals. The admission was more revealing than any court transcript. "I never meant to be so dry," he said, "but the law has a way of making you a machine if you let it." "You were kind when it mattered," I replied. "Kindness doesn't need to be dramatic." He hesitated, and then, with his characteristic bluntness, said, "Do you ever think about keeping the card as a token?" I touched my handbag where the card lay in a shoebox deeper than the purse, a relic and evidence, as the narrative had arranged. I think about it like a scar, I said. It's there. It tells a story, but I am not wearing it every day. Parker nodded, his fingers drumming on the table. Good, he said. We need people who keep their stories and don't let them harden into armor. Word of my small public work leaked, mostly through people who like to assemble narratives. The woman from the office told her neighbor, who told someone from the church, and a dish of compassion had quietly been passed around. There were tea invitations I accepted, and others I declined. I chose carefully. Charity felt to me like a garment that had to fit, not a performance to be applauded. When I showed up at the neighborhood potluck, I brought a simple loaf of bread, my hands coated in flour and sense of proportion. I did not make the obligatory course that was meant to impress. I made what I liked to eat. That night at the potluck, Tiffany appeared. She did not storm in with theatrical malice. Instead, she slid through the room with the casual grace of someone who had been socialized to assume access. She spoke to people, offered a laugh, extended a plate toward the buffet. For a moment, I considered excusing myself. Then I remembered the little lines about courage my father had written and felt the steadiness of my own feet on the floor. She came over to where I stood near the table, her voice softened by the hum of conversation. "I heard you've been busy," she said. Her smile was practiced. It did not reach her eyes. "Somewhat," I answered. My voice contained nothing of the old tremor. My hands were warm from kneading. They did not look like someone perpetually on edge. She put on a face meant to charm, one I had seen many times, then added, in a quieter tone, "I hope you know I didn't mean any harm." I measured my response. There was, for a long while, an absurd temptation to explain everything, to force her to understand that harm need not be intentional to be real. But I had learned that explanation is sometimes a spectacle others demand for their conscience, not for restitution. I decided deliberately to refuse the show. "I know you didn't," I said slowly, "but I needed the truth to be practical rather than pleasant. That's different." She blinked, a small shift of annoyance, not unlike the way one reacts when a favored script is interrupted. "Maybe," she said. "I was only trying to keep things moving." "So was I answered. "I just kept my feet." There was a pause in which the room hummed around us. She looked at me as if measuring whether the old instinct, apology that required repair of her own conscience, had returned. It had not. "Well," she said at last, opening the gap of forced civility, "I suppose people have to make choices." "We all make them," I agreed, and left it at that. She watched me go, perhaps hunting for a dramatized reaction. I gave her none. After she left, Kevin found me at the sink, rinsing my hands. He wrapped a towel around my shoulders and said little. We did not need to rehearse words. The simple contact of someone who had once taken for granted my labor and now offered warmth without expectation was enough. His hand at the small of my back had the awkwardness of someone learning how to be present without commandeering. "You handled her well," he said, and I could hear that he meant more than the exchange. "She handled herself, too," I told him. "People are capable of the most ordinary evasions." There were nights when I woke and felt the old readiness reach for me like a reflex. In those moments, I would hold my hands under the warm coverlet and whisper, not to any deity but to myself, that boundaries were not punishments. They were the architecture of a life. Sometimes the boy would wander into our room and, seeing me awake, ask for a story. I would tell him one, a small invention about a woman who kept a garden and learned to let some weeds go, and he would fall asleep counting the spaces between the words. The shoebox with the card did its duty as a repository of memory. I took it out one afternoon because I wanted to know whether the object had changed under my hands. It was the same pale plastic with a number embossed like a faint constellation. I thought about what it had meant. Privilege extended without consent, a small key to other people's demands. I held it, and then, in a way that surprised me by its theatricality, I took a pair of scissors and cut it in two. It was an unnecessary drama, perhaps. You could have destroyed it by shoving it into a drawer and letting it biodegrade into forgetfulness, but the act felt like a private liturgy. I did not throw the halves away. I placed them back in the shoebox with my father's card and a postage stamp-sized photograph of a house we had once visited when I was small. The box was then wrapped in paper and tucked back on the highest shelf of the closet. It was not a purge so much as a careful reordering. The things that had held power over me were now artifacts, not instruments. Letters arrived with the peculiar regularity of small surprises. One was from Robert, his handwriting brisk, efficient, and it contained a final account of fees and filings, the kind of meticulous closure that lawyers like to produce. He wrote, "Case closed, pending any appeal," as he had before, and penciled a line beneath that read, "You did right by yourself." The line looked almost affectionate, despite its propriety. Another letter came, thin and perfumed, from an acquaintance from years ago who had remembered my birthday and sent a postcard with a pressed leaf. I placed it on the mantel beside the teapot and felt the domestic tableau arrange itself into a different balance. Objects that belonged to a life I had chosen, not merely inherited. There were moments, too, of cost. Financially, the rearrangement of accounts and the attention to detail did not leave me wealthy. There were repairs to be paid, an old car to keep running, a college deposit to plan for. But scarcity had a sharper edge now. We were responsible for the shape of our lives. The boy earned a little from a weekend babysitting job, and Kevin took on the plumbing repairs he had long deferred. Practicality in a household became a shared language rather than a monologue of sacrifice. One afternoon, Parker came by with a packet of old court notices he had been given to archive. We sat at the kitchen table with the sunlight slanting through the blinds, and he read aloud a passage from an article about how small legal irregularities often cascade into erasures of identity. He passed the packet to me with an expression that was not quite the professional distance of before. There was now a softer curiosity. "You ever think about writing?" he asked suddenly. "About telling it, what you learned. People need maps." The idea surprised me in its clarity. I had not considered publication. There was a private pleasure in the ordered life I had rebuilt, but the thought of making a map, of rendering my steps legible to someone else, felt useful. I told him I would think about it. He nodded with the kind of respect that belonged to someone who had once called himself my investigator and now seemed more like a friend. Weeks passed in the ordinary way in which lives are repaired, not with a single tidy fold, but with a series of adjustments small enough to be almost invisible. Kevin began to take on a larger share of the shopping and to ask my opinion before making a decision that affected all of us. He apologized, carefully, without making it a performance. He learned to heat leftover stew without asking if it would be acceptable, to insist gently that his son take more milk because boys sometimes forget to nourish themselves. The boy, for his part, started a small ritual of leaving a note on the kitchen counter when he had borrowed something. Taken, drill, returning, Saturday. It was a graffiti of adulthood in miniature. One evening, while the rain smudged the streetlights into watercolor, I sat on the porch with the teapot between my hands. We had not spoken of everything that had happened. Some things settle by themselves, others require time. The storm that had once been my life, the constant expectation of accommodating everyone else's convenience, had not disappeared, but it had diminished to weather I could forecast and prepare for. Kevin came out and wrapped his arm around my shoulder. The boy, returning from a friend's house with scraped knees and a triumphant grin, announced that he had made tea for his teacher as thanks for a kind note. The household felt full, not because it was perfect, but because it had learned to instruct itself in courtesy. I thought of my father's letter again, those small kinds of courage that kept a door shut because the image fit the way I now measured bravery. It was not an explosion, but a daily discipline. Saying no without rancor, saying yes without feeling obligated, tending to my own kitchen as if it were a small altar. I raised my teacup and drank, tasting not only the cinnamon and the dark ease of coffee, but the residue of a life that had been negotiated back into my hands. There was an accidental tenderness in the way the house aligned itself every morning. A shelf rearranged with the teapot at its center, jars labeled in my tidy script, a list of tasks pinned to the fridge in Kevin's blocky handwriting. These were not trophies, they were markers of a domestic vocabulary that now belonged to us all. When a cousin called from out of state to ask about our well-being, I answered without the practiced reserve I had once adopted. I told him about the small renovations we'd made and the way a particular plant in the bay window had returned to life after a winter of neglect. He laughed and said, "Sounds peaceful. Are you happy?" The question was blunt and precarious, as if it expected an exclamation. "I'm content," I said, because happiness felt too public a word. Contentment had a seat in my chest where it warmed slowly and thoroughly. And I am building a life that is mine. He followed with a softer question. What would you do differently? And I thought about all the things. Teach my son to make arrangements, say no earlier, keep papers private unless they were needed, refuse to let my value be measured by my service to others. My answer was longer, winding through small reflections, and at the end I realized that the telling of it felt like the first draft of a map. There would be other days, harder ones. There would be letters that reopened the old calculations, attempts at reconciliation that were complicated by self-interest masquerading as regret. There would be the occasional domestic difficulty, the car that broke down at the worst possible moment, the nights when I woke with a sudden clenching fear about money or about reputation. But there was, too, the practical knowledge that I could respond with ordinary courage, the kind that kept doors closed, that called for help when needed, that refused to make the hush into its own prison. On a final, quiet Sunday, final only in the sense that the week had made a small, important turn, I stood at the sink and washed a pan I had used for nothing more ostentatious than scrambled eggs. Kevin hummed in the other room. The boy was building a fort of blankets and pillows in the living room and had left the tea cooling on its tray. I held the pan under the water and felt the geometry of my life, a series of choices, not all heroic but deliberate, arrange itself into a pattern I could live with. I reached for the box on the shelf, the shoebox that still contained the halves of the card. For a moment, I considered scattering them into the compost, letting Earth be the final arbiter. Instead, I placed the box on the windowsill where light could trace the edges of its contents. The paper on the outside was neat, my father's handwriting legible across the band that kept it closed. It was a small shrine to endurance, not triumph. The radio, tuned to an old station that played songs like Familiar Friends, filled the kitchen with a melody that sounded like late afternoon. I sat with the teapot between my hands and felt the steady weight of a life that had been reclaimed, not in boisterous declarations, but in the slow, careful cataloging of what mattered. I had learned to say no without apology. I had learned to ask for help without shame. I had learned that small reliances were not betrayals of independence. When the boy wandered in, sleepy and content, I made another cup of tea and poured him a little into chipped mug he liked. Kevin sat across the table and read a magazine he did not pretend to understand. We were, in our quiet way, assembled. There would be future decisions to be made about work, about school, about the unglamorous maintenance of a life that had barely been noticed until it had to be defended. But I felt, for the first time in a long while, that I possessed a practice for such governance: steady feet across the kitchen in the morning, the authority to lock and unlatch doors, the capacity to choose what I would contain and what I would release. The teapot steamed between us. I lifted my cup and tasted the bitterness and the warmth together. My father's line about small kinds of courage played through my mind like a refrain. I smiled without ceremony because some acts did not call for celebration, only for continuance. Outside, the evening softened. Inside, the house folded itself into ordinary motions. I stayed at the window a little longer, watching the street, the lamps, the few people who passed by with their own lives to tend. The world had not become a kinder place because I had set a boundary. It had simply become more correct for me. That sufficed. I took the shoebox down one last time and, with my thumb on the lid, imagined all the ways a life could be rearranged without spectacle. I closed the box, placed it back on the shelf, and turned the key to the kitchen light off. The room dimmed, the teapot cooled. I made my way back to the table, sat, and let the sound of the radio and the quiet of our breaths enter the spaces between us. There was no final note of triumph, only the steady, ongoing business of living upright. I breathed in, and the air tasted faintly of cinnamon and coffee, ordinary and enough.